In the frozen wasteland of the Ardennes, where winter turned battlefields into killing grounds, one American soldier made a choice that defied every instinct of survival. Private Silas Miller, just 20 years old, volunteered to stay behind alone in a crumbling farmhouse while his squad retreated from an advancing German Panzer column. For 40 agonizing minutes, this farm boy from Iowa became the only barrier between 3 wounded men and certain death. With nothing but dwindling ammunition, a single explosive charge, and the kind of courage that separates the living from the legends, Miller waged a one-man war against overwhelming odds. What happened in that ruined cellar beneath the snow would become a testament to American resolve, a story of technical superiority meeting moral conviction, where youth confronted darkness and refused to blink. December 22, 1944, 3:47 in the afternoon. The farmhouse shuddered as another shell struck its northern wall. Plaster dust cascaded through fractured beams, settling like ash on Private Silas Miller's shoulders as he crouched at the cellar entrance. His breath came in visible clouds, each exhalation a small surrender of body heat to the Belgian winter. Below him, in the darkness that smelled of earth and blood and fear, 3 men lay broken on makeshift stretchers. Corporal Jensen with his shattered femur. Private First Class Kowalski with his chest wound that bubbled pink with each shallow breath. Sergeant Holloway, unconscious, his head wrapped in bandages that had started white. Miller's hands trembled, not from cold, though the temperature had dropped to 14 degrees Fahrenheit, but from the weight of what he had just volunteered to do. "You sure about this, kid?" Staff Sergeant Reeves had asked, his face a map of doubt beneath his helmet. Behind him, the rest of Second Squad was already pulling back through the tree line, shadows disappearing into the gray-white maze of the Ardennes forest. Miller had nodded. Had to nod. Because the alternative, leaving these men to the approaching panzers, wasn't survival. It was surrender of a different kind. Now Reeves and the others were gone, and Miller was alone with his Springfield rifle, 73 rounds of ammunition, 2 grenades, 1 Composition C explosive charge, and a promise he wasn't sure he could keep. The sound reached him first, that distinctive metallic shriek of tank treads crushing frozen earth, then the rumble deep enough to vibrate in his chest cavity. Miller moved to the shattered window frame, pressing himself against the cold stone wall. Through the skeletal remains of what had been a barn, he could see them. 4 German Panther tanks, their long 75-millimeter guns sweeping the terrain like the heads of predatory animals. Behind them, perhaps 24 infantry, gray figures moving with the methodical efficiency of men who believed they'd already won. They were heading straight for the farmhouse. Miller's mind raced through his options with the frantic speed of a trapped animal seeking escape routes. He could see with brutal clarity what would happen if he did nothing. The panzers would roll past. Infantry would sweep the building, find the cellar, find the wounded. The Malmedy massacre had been just 6 days ago. 84 American POWs executed in a field, their bodies left frozen in the snow. The stories had spread through the American lines like poison, and every soldier knew what surrender might mean in this sector. But he was one man, one 20-year-old private from Cedar Rapids who had been in Europe for exactly 68 days, who had fired his rifle at human targets exactly 11 times and still wasn't sure if he'd hit anything. Who had written his mother every Sunday without fail careful letters that mentioned the beauty of the Belgian countryside and the kindness of the locals, and nothing about the screaming, nothing about the way frozen bodies looked like discarded mannequins, nothing about the smell. The lead Panther was 300 yards out now, 250. Miller looked back at the cellar entrance. He could hear Kowalski's labored breathing. That terrible wet sound that meant the chest wound was worse than anyone wanted to admit. Jensen had been quiet for the last 10 minutes, either unconscious or working very hard not to scream. Holloway hadn't made a sound since they'd carried him in at 0900, his skull fractured by shrapnel from a tree burst. 3 men, Miller thought. 3 American lives. He'd grown up on 40 acres outside Cedar Rapids, the youngest of 4 brothers. His father had raised dairy cattle and held firm opinions about responsibility. You milk before dawn because the cows depend on you. You fix the fence before it breaks because the animals can't fix it themselves. You don't leave a job half done because someone else might not finish it right. Simple farm logic. But standing in that ruined farmhouse with death approaching at 12 miles per hour, Miller understood his father's lessons had never been about cows at all. 200 yards. He moved with sudden purpose, no longer thinking, just doing. The Composition C charge went into his pack along with the detonator wire. His grenades clipped to his belt. The Springfield came up to his shoulder with a familiar weight that steadied his breathing. Through his sights he could see the commander of the lead Panther, half visible in the open cupola, scanning the farmhouse through binoculars. Miller exhaled slowly, squeezed the trigger. The shot cracked across the frozen landscape. The commander jerked backward, dropped into the tank. Miller was already moving, firing twice more at the infantry, then sprinting to the eastern window. The tactical mathematics were simple. Make them think there were multiple shooters. Make them hesitate. Every second of hesitation was a second closer to American air support, to reinforcements, to anything that might turn this from suicide into survival. The Panthers halted. The infantry scattered, taking cover behind frozen furrows in the field. Miller fired from the eastern window, hit dirt, scrambled to the south side of the farmhouse, fired twice more. 5 rounds gone, 68 remaining, but they were thinking now. He could see it in the way they moved. More cautious, more spread out. Good. Caution took time. The first Panther fired. The 75-millimeter shell punched through the northern wall of the farmhouse like a fist through paper, exploded in what had been the main room, filled the air with stone fragments and splintered wood, and the acrid stink of high explosive. The concussion knocked Miller sideways, left his ears ringing with a high-pitched whine that wouldn't stop. He scrambled back to the window. The Panthers were advancing again, but slower now, infantry moving in support. Standard combined arms tactics. The Americans had studied them at Fort Benning, where instructors with pointer sticks had explained how German mechanized warfare had conquered Europe. But there was a difference between studying tactics on a chalkboard and facing them in a Belgian farmhouse while your brain tried to remember how your ears were supposed to work. Miller checked his ammunition, 63 rounds. Not enough. Would never be enough. The lead Panther was 150 yards out now, its gun traversing toward the farmhouse. Miller knew what came next. They'd shell the building to rubble, then send in infantry to clear the ruins. Textbook. Efficient. Deadly. Unless he changed the equation. Miller grabbed his pack, pulled out the Composition C. 3 pounds of explosive, moldable and powerful, the kind of charge combat engineers use to blow bridges and bunkers. He'd been carrying it since they'd cleared the last German position 2 days ago. Meant to turn it into the supply sergeant, but never got around to it. Now his father's voice echoed in his head. Keep your tools sharp. You never know when you'll need them. He moved to the cellar, descended 6 steps into the darkness. Kowalski's eyes found him in the gloom, wide and frightened. Private? Kowalski's voice was a whisper, tight with pain. What's happening? Stay quiet, Miller said, surprised by how calm he sounded. Stay down. Don't move, unless I tell you to. He didn't wait for a response. Back up the stairs through the ruined farmhouse, out the back door where the barn's skeletal frame provided some cover. The Panthers were 100 yards out now, 75. The infantry was spreading wider, flanking positions, professional and patient. Miller ran. He ran in a crouch through the frozen landscape, using the terrain the way his oldest brother had taught him to hunt deer in the Iowa woods, move when they're not looking, freeze when they are, use every ditch and tree, and shadow. The Panthers kept advancing toward the farmhouse, their attention fixed on the building where they thought the American defenders were concentrated. 50 yards to their flank. 40. Miller reached a drainage ditch, dropped into it, started shaping the Composition C with fingers that no longer had feeling. The lead Panther was 30 yards away now, its armor sloped and thick, impervious to small arms fire. But Miller wasn't thinking about small arms. He was thinking about his father's tractor, the time the fuel line had ruptured and nearly caught fire. The time his brother had shown him where machines were vulnerable, not where they were strong, but where they needed to be weak to function, the Panther's rear compartment where the engine lived. Where fuel and ammunition and all the things that made it a weapon converged in one potentially catastrophic space. Miller attached the detonator wire with hands that shook so badly he nearly dropped it twice, unspooled the wire back down the ditch, 20 yards, 30. The Panther rumbled past, 15 feet away, so close he could smell the diesel exhaust and see the Balkenkreuz painted on its hull. He twisted the detonator handles. The explosion was magnificent and terrible. The Composition C detonated against the Panther's engine compartment with a crack that seemed to split the sky. The tank lurched, stopped, began vomiting black smoke from every seam. Someone inside screamed, a sound that would live in Miller's nightmares for the next 60 years. The crew bailout hatch flew open. Men emerged, burning. Miller didn't watch. He was already moving, sprinting back toward the farmhouse, while the other 3 Panthers tried to locate the threat. He could hear officers shouting in German, confused, angry. The infantry had gone to ground, uncertain. The mathematical equation had changed. Not a farmhouse with a handful of defenders, but an unknown number of Americans with anti-tank capabilities, operating from concealed positions. Doubt. He'd given them doubt. Miller crashed back into the farmhouse, took position at the eastern window. His ammunition count was burned into his brain now, 63 rounds. The second Panther was traversing its turret, searching. Miller fired twice at the infantry, shifted position, fired twice more from the southern window, made them think, made them guess. Minutes crawled past like hours. The Panthers held position, reluctant to advance without knowing where the anti-tank weapons were hidden. The infantry stayed low. Miller fired when he had a target, moved constantly, made noise in empty rooms. His grandfather had told him stories about the Argonne Forest, about how American soldiers had used captured German equipment to confuse enemy positions, about how warfare was as much psychology as physics. 27 minutes in, Miller was down to 41 rounds and both grenades. His hands were steady now, his breathing controlled. The fear hadn't left. It never left. But it had transformed into something else. Focus. Purpose. The same feeling he got during harvest season when the work was brutal and endless but necessary, when you couldn't afford to think about tired because the corn wouldn't wait. Then he heard it. The sound that changed everything. High altitude, getting closer. The distinctive roar of American P-47 Thunderbolts, their engines unmistakable. Miller didn't know if it was coincidence, didn't know if Reeves had reached friendly lines and called in air support, didn't care. He just knew salvation was 30 seconds away. The Germans heard it too. The Panthers began backing up, trying to retreat to the tree line, where branches would provide some cover from aerial attack. The infantry was moving now, tactical withdrawal, still organized but accelerating toward panic. Miller emptied his magazine at them, reloaded, fired again. Not to hit, though he thought he might have dropped one or two, but to keep them moving, keep them exposed, give the Thunderbolts clean targets. The first P-47 came in low, its 8 50 caliber machine guns opening up with a sound like the world being torn in half. Tracers walked across the frozen field, found the second Panther, chewed through its thinner top armor. The tank exploded in a fireball that sent pieces of metal spinning through the air like deadly confetti. The second Thunderbolt came in from the opposite direction, caught the fleeing infantry in the open, and the field became a slaughterhouse. Miller turned away from the window. He descended into the cellar where Kowalski was staring up at the ceiling, tears streaming down his face. "Is it over?" Kowalski whispered. Miller nodded, then realized he couldn't speak. His voice had gone somewhere else, left him with the adrenaline that was draining out of his body like water from a broken vessel. He sat down hard on the cellar floor, his rifle across his knees, and tried to remember how to breathe normally. Above them, the thunderbolts made another pass. Someone was screaming in German. Someone else was calling for a medic in English. American voices, American help, American victory. Miller closed his eyes and saw his father's farm. The way morning sunlight caught the dew on the pasture grass, the sound of cows lowing to be milked, the simple certainty of work that needed doing. The official after-action report filed by Staff Sergeant William Reeves on December 23, 1944, would note the following facts with military precision. Private Silas Miller, serial number 3762148, 5, 2nd Squad, Dog Company, 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, 101st Airborne Division, voluntarily remained in defensive position to protect 3 wounded personnel while his unit executed tactical withdrawal under enemy pressure. Private Miller engaged enemy armor and infantry for approximately 40 minutes, employing small arms fire and demolition charges to delay enemy advance until arrival of close air support. 3 wounded personnel successfully evacuated. Private Miller sustained minor injuries, shrapnel wounds to left shoulder and arm, moderate hearing loss, first-degree frostbite to fingers and toes. Recommended for Bronze Star with V device for valor, but numbers and military language could not capture what happened in that farmhouse cellar. They couldn't capture the moment Kowalski grabbed Miller's hand as they loaded him onto the stretcher, held it with desperate strength, and couldn't find words adequate to what needed saying. Or the way Jensen, delirious with pain and morphine, kept repeating, "Just a kid, he's just a kid," until the medics told him to save his strength. Or how Sergeant Halloway, who regained consciousness 3 days later in a field hospital, would spend the rest of his life trying to pay forward a debt he could never fully repay. The mathematics of that afternoon were simple. 1 man, 73 rounds of ammunition, 1 explosive charge, against 4 Panther tanks, 24 infantry, and the weight of the German war machine that had conquered most of Europe. But the true equation was more complex. 1 man multiplied by conviction, divided by fear, raised to the power of necessity. And the answer came out in American lives saved. The Battle of the Bulge would continue for another month. Bastogne would hold, though just barely, surrounded by German forces but never broken. The 101st Airborne would earn the nickname the Battered Bastards of Bastogne, and a place in military history. American forces would ultimately prevail, pushing the Germans back across the Siegfried Line, but at a cost of 19,000 American dead and 77,000 wounded or missing. In the grand sweep of that battle, the largest fought by the United States Army in World War II, Private Silas Miller's 40-minute stand was a footnote. The official histories would focus on the defense of Bastogne proper, on General McAuliffe's famous nuts response to German surrender demands, on the dramatic relief by Patton's Third Army. As they should. Those were the moments that shaped the battle's outcome. But history is not made only in the decisions of generals or the movements of armies. It is made in 1,000 small crucibles where individuals confront their capacity for courage and choose, or fail to choose, to act. Miller's stand mattered not because it changed the course of the war, but because it represented something essential about what Americans brought to that frozen forest. It wasn't just superior equipment, though the thunderbolts that saved Miller represented American industrial capacity that Germany could never match. It wasn't just numbers, though American forces would eventually overwhelm their opponents through sheer weight of materiel and men. It was something harder to quantify, but instantly recognizable to anyone who watched a 20-year-old farm kid volunteer to stay behind when every instinct screamed at him to run. The Germans at the Ardennes were fighting for a regime that measured human worth in race and obedience, that sent men into battle with orders that permitted, even encouraged, atrocity. The Americans were fighting for something messier and more complicated, a democracy that wasn't perfect, that had its own sins and failures, but that fundamentally believed in the worth of the individual, in the idea that every life mattered, that 3 wounded soldiers in a cellar were worth 1 man's impossible stand. Miller himself would never frame it that way. In the 63 years he lived after Bastogne, he rarely spoke about that afternoon. When pressed by his children or grandchildren, he would say only that he did what anyone would have done, that he wasn't special, that the real heroes were the men who didn't come home. But those who served with him knew differently. June 6, 1945. Germany had surrendered. The war in Europe was over. Miller stood in a displaced persons camp outside Pilsen, Czechoslovakia, helping distribute food and supplies to refugees. The war had moved him through France and Germany, through the Rhineland and across the Elbe, through firefights and artillery barrages and all the grinding chaos of mechanized warfare. He had killed men, knew it for certain now, had watched them fall, and carried that knowledge like a stone in his chest. But on this morning, in this camp, he was handing out chocolate bars to children who spoke languages he couldn't understand, but whose gratitude needed no translation. An elderly woman, Czech or Polish or maybe Jewish, he couldn't tell and it didn't matter, pressed something into his hand. A small wooden carving of a bird, its wings spread in flight. She said something he didn't understand, but her eyes were wet, and he understood that well enough. Miller held the carving carefully, this gift from a woman who had nothing and yet chose to give. And he thought about that afternoon in the farmhouse, about the impossible mathematics that had somehow worked out, about how Kowalski had recovered, had walked again, had returned to Chicago to teach high school history, about how Jensen's leg had healed mostly, enough that he could work his father's hardware store, about how Sergeant Halloway had survived his head injury, had commanded men through the rest of the war, had lived to see his grandchildren. 3 men who might have died, who lived instead because one scared kid from Iowa had decided that running wasn't an option, that some things were worth the risk, that surrender, even to overwhelming odds, meant giving up something more valuable than life. The bird's wooden wings caught the morning light. Miller closed his fingers around it and wondered if this was what victory actually looked like, not the grand parades or the surrender documents, but this quiet exchange between strangers who had both survived the unsurvivable. This small gift that said you mattered, what you did mattered. Thank you for not giving up. In the official record, Private Silas Miller would receive the Bronze Star with V Device for Valor, presented by Colonel Robert Sink in a ceremony Miller barely remembered. He would be honorably discharged in October 1945 with the rank of sergeant, though he never felt comfortable with the promotion. He would return to Cedar Rapids, marry Elizabeth Hartman, raise 4 children, and take over his father's farm when the old man's hands got too arthritic to milk the cows. He would become a deacon in his church, serve on the school board, and live a quiet life that looked from the outside like 1,000 other quiet American lives. But every year, on December 22nd, he would wake before dawn and go to the barn, stand in the cold dark, and remember the weight of the Springfield, the sound of tank treads on frozen ground, the impossible mathematics of one against many, the way Kowalski's hand had gripped his, desperate and grateful and unable to let go. He never spoke about what he remembered on those mornings. Elizabeth knew better than to ask. She would just make coffee, strong and black the way he liked it, and be there when he came back inside, and that was enough. The farmhouse outside Bastogne still stands, though barely. The Belgian government designated it a historical site in 1973, though few tourists visit. The cellar remains damp and dark, exactly as it was. The walls still bear the marks of the 75mm shells. The field where the Panthers burned has been planted over, returned to agriculture, though farmers still occasionally turn up spent brass or twisted metal in their plows. In 2004, on the 60th anniversary of the battle, Jensen's grandson made the pilgrimage. He stood in that cellar and tried to imagine his grandfather lying there, wounded and terrified, listening to one man hold the line above. He couldn't do it. The math wouldn't work. One man couldn't stop 4 tanks and 24 soldiers. It was impossible. But the after-action report said it happened. The Bronze Star citation confirmed it. And his grandfather, before he died, had told him it was true. Sometimes the impossible simply refuses to remain impossible. Sometimes a 20-year-old farm kid from Iowa decides that surrender isn't an option, that 3 lives are worth any risk, that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the refusal to let fear make your decisions. Sometimes the last sentinel stands his ground, and the world changes because he does. Silas Miller died on March 14, 2007, at the age of 83. His funeral was well attended, but not remarkable. The pastor spoke about his faith, his dedication to his family, his service to his community. There was a military honor guard. Miller had earned that, and a flag that was folded with crisp precision and presented to his widow. Taps echoed across the cemetery in Cedar Rapids, where Miller was buried next to his father and mother, next to the farm he'd spent his life working. The obituary in the Cedar Rapids Gazette noted his military service in one sentence. Silas served in the United States Army during World War II and was awarded the Bronze Star. It didn't mention Bastogne, didn't mention the farmhouse or the cellar or the 40 minutes that defined him more completely than anything else he would do in his long life. Miller wouldn't have wanted it mentioned. He'd spent 63 years trying to be something other than a war hero, trying to live normally in a world that seemed determined to treat him differently because of one afternoon when he'd been too scared to run and too stubborn to quit. But at the funeral in the back row sat 3 men. Kowalski, 84 years old, who had flown in from Chicago. Jensen, 82, driven by his son from Milwaukee. And Halloway's son, representing his father who had died 2 years earlier, but who had made his son promise, "If I don't make it to Miller's funeral, you go. You tell him thank you. You tell him I never forgot." After the ceremony, after the reception, after most people had left, these 3 men stood at Miller's grave. They didn't say much. What was there to say that hadn't been said 1,000 times in the 63 years since that frozen afternoon? Kowalski placed his hand on the headstone, the way he'd gripped Miller's hand in the cellar, desperate and grateful. Jensen saluted, crisp and military, the way he'd been taught at Fort Benning 70 years ago. And Halloway's son read a letter his father had written, but never sent, a letter that said simply, "You were the bravest man I ever knew, and I owed you my life, and I hope I used it well enough to honor your courage." Then they left, these last witnesses to the impossible, and Miller rested in the Iowa earth that had shaped him, among the ghosts of the cows he'd milked, and the fields he'd planted, and the simple necessary work that had defined his days. The story should have ended there. But stories, true stories, stories about real people and real courage, have a way of refusing to end cleanly. In 2019, a researcher for the National World War II Museum in New Orleans found Kowalski's grandson through a genealogy website. The grandson had inherited Kowalski's papers, including a detailed diary of his time in the 101st Airborne. The diary contained a full account of December 22, 1944, written in the shaky handwriting of a man trying to remember while he still could. The account was published in the museum's journal. A documentary filmmaker read it. The story of Miller's stand began to circulate, slowly at first, then with increasing momentum. YouTube videos, podcast episodes, a segment on the History Channel. The impossible mathematics of that afternoon resonating with a new generation, trying to understand what their grandparents had done in the frozen forests of Europe. Some of the comments on those videos questioned whether it was real. 4 tanks seemed like too many. 40 minutes seemed too long. 1 man seemed too impossible. But those who'd served, who'd been in Iraq or Afghanistan, or any of the places where America had asked its young people to face impossible odds, those commenters recognized the truth, because they'd seen it themselves. The moment when training and fear and duty and something indefinable all collided, and an ordinary person did something extraordinary, not because they were special, but because the alternative was unthinkable. "I was at Fallujah," one commenter wrote, "second battle. And I saw a corporal do something almost exactly like this, hold a stairwell against insurgents while his squad evacuated wounded. He wasn't trying to be a hero. He was just trying to keep his people alive. That's what Miller was doing. That's what we all try to do when it matters. Another. My grandfather was at Bastogne. Different unit. But he said the same thing, that the battle was won by 1,000 small stands, by guys who decided not to run when running made sense. Miller's story sounds impossible until you understand that's what it took to win. A whole army of guys doing impossible things. The last word belongs to Kowalski, writing in his diary 3 weeks after the battle, his handwriting still uncertain but determined. People will want to know why Miller stayed. They'll want some grand reason, some speech about democracy or freedom or duty. But I was there. I looked him in the eyes before he went upstairs for the last time. And what I saw wasn't heroism. It was just a scared kid who'd done the math and didn't like the answer, but was going to solve the problem anyway. That's what made him extraordinary. Not that he wasn't afraid. He was terrified. Not that he was special. He was just a farm kid from Iowa who'd been in Europe 2 months. But when it mattered, when 3 lives depended on him, he chose to stay. Simple as that. I've thought a lot about courage since then, and I think it's not about being fearless. It's about being afraid and staying anyway. It's about looking at impossible odds and deciding that some things are worth the risk. It's about being so committed to keeping your people alive that you'll trade your own survival for the chance, just the chance, that they might make it. Miller gave us that chance. And Jensen and me and the sergeant, we lived. We got to go home, got to have families, got to live full lives. All because one 20-year-old kid decided that running wasn't an option. I don't know if I ever thanked him properly. I tried, but how do you thank someone for your life? What words are big enough for that? So I'm writing this instead, leaving it for whoever comes after. And I'm saying, remember Silas Miller. Remember that courage isn't the absence of fear. Remember that one person in the right place at the right time refusing to quit, that can change everything. Remember that the line between us and darkness is sometimes just one scared kid who decides to stand. December 22nd, 1944, 3:47 in the afternoon. In a ruined farmhouse outside Bastogne, Private Silas Miller checked his ammunition count one last time. 73 rounds, 1 explosive charge, 2 grenades, against impossible odds. But he wasn't thinking about the odds. He was thinking about 3 men in a cellar who couldn't defend themselves. He was thinking about his father's voice. You don't leave a job half done. He was thinking that some things were worth the risk. He was 20 years old, and he was terrified. And he was the last sentinel between his people and the darkness. And he stood his ground. Because that's what Americans do.